Welcome. Hello and welcome. If you enjoy calm stories like this, tap like and subscribe for a new one each week. Let's begin. Find a place of rest now. Let your head feel heavy on the pillow. Let your shoulders soften, releasing the work of the day. Feel the gentle weight of the blankets around you, a soft and quiet anchor in the calm of this moment. We are going on a journey tonight, not to a faraway land of fantasy, but to a time not so very long ago, a time of gas lamps and quiet, snowy streets. We are traveling to the city of Toronto in the year 1921. Our story is a gentle one, but it begins in a place of shadow. It is a story about a sickness, a mystery that had puzzled doctors for thousands of years. But more than that, it is a story of hope. It is a story of how a few dedicated people, working in quiet laboratories through long nights, found a key that would unlock a prison. It is the story of insulin, a substance so powerful it could awaken children from comas and give them back their lives. They called it the Toronto Miracle. As you listen, let the rhythm of the words guide your breathing. Inhale slowly and exhale completely. There will be no startling sounds, no jarring moments. Only the steady, calm unfolding of a remarkable tale. Imagine the soft hiss of a Bunsen burner in a university laboratory late at night. Picture the gentle crunch of snow underfoot on a cold Canadian evening. Hear the quiet, hopeful whispers in a hospital ward where, for the first time, a true healing was about to begin. This is not a story that demands your attention. It is a story that invites you to drift, to float on the surface of the words, letting them carry you toward a place of deep and peaceful rest. If you fall asleep before the end, that is perfectly all right. The story will be here for you another time. For now, just breathe. Let go of your thoughts. Let us turn back the clock and begin our journey into the heart of a quiet miracle. Breathe in and breathe out. And let us begin. Chapter 1. A fatal diagnosis. Before the miracle, there was the waiting. For centuries, it was known by many names, but its nature was always the same. The ancient Egyptians noted it in their scrolls, a mysterious affliction that caused a person to pass too much water, to waste away to nothing. In ancient Greece, a physician named Erytaeus gave it the name we still use today, diabetes, from the Greek word for siphon, because it was as if life itself was being siphoned out of the body. He described it as a melting down of the flesh and limbs into urine. For 2,000 years, that description remained tragically accurate. To receive a diagnosis of what was then called diabetes mellitus, Latin word for honey, added in the 17th century when doctors discovered the urine of patients was strangely sweet, was to be given a death sentence. It was a slow, inexorable fading. The body, unable to use the sugar from food for energy, would begin to consume itself. Patients felt a raging, unquenchable thirst and a desperate, gnawing hunger. Yet, no matter how much they ate or drank, they grew thinner and weaker. Their breath might carry a strange, sweet, chemical odor, like nail polish or rotting apples, the smell of a body turning on its own tissues for fuel. By the turn of the 20th century, the great hospitals of the world had special wards for these patients. They were often called coma wards. Here, Mostly children and young adults lay in rows of beds, their bodies skeletal, their skin dry and papery. They were simply waiting for the end. The air in these rooms was heavy with a unique kind of stillness, a quiet that was not peaceful but resigned. Nurses would move softly from bed to bed, offering sips of water, adjusting pillows, speaking in hushed tones. The families would sit vigil, watching the person they loved simply vanish before their eyes. A child who had been playing in the street just months before might now weigh less than 30 pounds, their eyes large and sunken in a face devoid of youthful roundness. The final stage was the coma, a deep, unrousable sleep from which there was no return. From diagnosis to death, the timeline was often less than a year. For a young child, it could be a matter of weeks. Doctors were not without ideas, but their best efforts were heartbreakingly futile. They tried countless remedies: opium, glycerin, dietary restrictions of every imaginable kind. Nothing worked. The most significant attempt at treatment before our story truly begins came from a physician in America named Dr. Frederick Allen. He reasoned that if the body could not process sugar from food, then the only logical step was to remove the food. His treatment, which became known as the Allen diet, was, in essence, a carefully managed starvation. Imagine being a parent in the year 1920. Your 10-year-old daughter has been diagnosed. You take her to the most famous specialist, and he places her on this regimen. Her daily intake would be reduced to a shocking minimum, perhaps 400 or 500 calories. Tiny portions of washed bran, a few green vegetables, perhaps a sliver of protein. The goal was to keep the blood sugar as low as possible, to stave off the inevitable coma. And for a time, it worked. The Allen diet could extend a life from a few months to a year, maybe 2. But at a terrible cost. The patients lived in a state of perpetual, agonizing hunger. They were weak, emaciated, and freezing cold, even in summer, because their bodies had no fuel to generate warmth. They were alive, but it was a ghost-like existence. One of the most famous patients of this era was a young girl named Elizabeth Hughes. She was the daughter of a very prominent American politician, Charles Evans Hughes. Diagnosed at age 11, she was placed on the strict Allen diet. Her diaries from that time are a poignant record of a childhood lost to a medical regimen. She wrote of her dreams of food, of the constant, gnawing emptiness in her stomach. By the time she was 14, she stood 5 feet tall but weighed only 45 pounds. She was a living skeleton, kept alive by sheer will and the discipline of starvation. Her life, and thousands of others like hers, was a race against time. The diet could delay the end, but it could not prevent it. Eventually, the body would succumb to a small infection, or the heart would simply give out. Or, inevitably, the patient would slip into the diabetic coma from which there was no escape. This was the world before insulin. It was a world of quiet desperation, of families watching their loved ones fade away. It was a world where doctors, for all their knowledge and compassion, could offer little more than a managed decline. They knew the problem was related to the pancreas, a small, leaf-shaped organ tucked behind the stomach. As far back as 1889, 2 researchers in Germany had shown that when they removed the pancreas from a dog, the animal immediately developed all the symptoms of severe diabetes. So, the pancreas clearly held the key. Somewhere inside that organ was a substance that allowed the body to use sugar. But what was it, and how could it be extracted? This was the great puzzle. Many tried to solve it. Researchers would grind up animal pancreases and inject the resulting crude mixture into diabetic animals. The results were always the same: failure. The injections were toxic. They caused fevers, abscesses, and did nothing to lower blood sugar. The problem, though they didn't fully understand it, was that the pancreas is a dual-function organ. It produces the powerful digestive juices that break down food in the intestine, but it also produces this other, more mysterious substance. When they ground up the whole organ, the digestive enzymes immediately destroyed the very thing they were trying to isolate. It was a biological lock, and for decades, no one could find the right key. Let us step back from the ward now, from the quiet beds and the waiting families. Let us leave the world of managed starvation and inevitable decline. Because in the autumn of 1920, in a small town in Ontario, Canada, a young doctor who was struggling to make a living was about to have an idea. It was a simple idea, scribbled down in the middle of the night. An idea that would change everything. The world was holding its breath, waiting for a miracle. And it was about to arrive, not with a thunderclap, but in the quiet stillness of a Canadian university laboratory. The long wait was almost over. Chapter 2: A Summer Idea. Our story now turns to a man named Frederick Banting. Fred Banting was not a celebrated scientist. In 1920, he was a 30-year-old physician and surgeon, recently returned from the Great War, where he had served as a medical officer and been wounded in combat. He was a man of great determination, but he was struggling. He had set up a small medical practice in the town of London, Ontario, but patients were few and far between. To make ends meet, he took on a part-time job as a demonstrator in the physiology department at the local university. On the evening of October the 30th, 1920, Banting was preparing a lecture for his students. The topic was the pancreas. It was not a subject he knew particularly well, so he sat in his small office, reading through medical journals to gather his thoughts. As the night grew late, he came across an article that described a rare case where the main pancreatic duct had been blocked by a gallstone. The blockage had caused the part of the pancreas that produces digestive enzymes to shrivel and die. But, the article noted, the small clusters of cells known as the islets of Langerhans, which were suspected of producing the anti-diabetic substance had survived. Banting was tired. He finished his reading, turned off the light, and went to bed. But his mind kept working. Something about that article had sparked a connection. The blockage, the shriveling of the digestive cells, the survival of the islets. The problem with all the previous experiments was that the digestive juices destroyed the internal secretion. But what if you could stop the digestive juices first? At 2 o'clock in the morning, he could not sleep. He got up, turned on the light, and grabbed a small notebook. In the quiet stillness of the night, he scribbled down a short, simple, sentencian idea, a hypothesis, a plan of action. The note read, "Ligate pancreatic ducts of dog. Wait 6 to 8 weeks. Remove and extract." Let us pause and appreciate the simple brilliance of this idea. Ligate means to tie off. Banting was proposing to surgically tie the pancreatic ducts of a dog. Based on the article he had read, this would cause the digestive enzyme-producing parts of the pancreas to wither away over several weeks. But the islets of Langerhans, which produced the mysterious internal secretion, would remain. Then, he could remove this degenerated pancreas, which would be free of the destructive digestive enzymes, and make an extract from it. This pure extract, he theorized, could then be injected into a diabetic dog. It was a way to get around the self-destruct mechanism that had thwarted everyone before him. This late-night idea consumed him. His small medical practice was failing anyway. He felt a powerful, driving need to pursue this. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. He was a surgeon, not a research scientist. He lacked the laboratory, the equipment, and the specialized knowledge of chemistry needed to carry out the work. He needed a patron, a place to work. His thoughts turned to the most prominent expert on carbohydrate metabolism in all of Canada, Professor John James Rickard MacLeod at the University of Toronto. MacLeod was, in many ways, Banting's opposite. He was a distinguished, established, and somewhat imposing figure in the world of medical research. A Scotsman by birth, he was cautious, methodical, and deeply skeptical. He had spent years studying diabetes and was well aware of the long, unbroken history of failures to isolate the internal secretion of the pancreas. In early November 1920, Banting closed his struggling practice and took the train to Toronto to meet with Professor MacLeod. The meeting did not go well at first. Banting, earnest and passionate, laid out his idea. MacLeod listened, but he was unimpressed. The idea was not entirely new, he pointed out. Others had tried similar things. He questioned Banting's surgical skills and his lack of research experience. Why should he, a world-renowned scientist, turn over his laboratory to an unknown country doctor with a speculative idea? But Banting was persistent. He was filled with a conviction that was hard to dismiss. Perhaps MacLeod saw a spark of something in the young surgeon's fiery determination. Or perhaps he simply thought the experiment, even if it failed, might produce some useful data. Whatever the reason, after much persuasion, MacLeod reluctantly agreed. He offered Banting laboratory space at the university for 8 weeks during the upcoming summer holiday, when the labs would be mostly empty. He would provide 10 dogs for the experiments. And he would assign him a student assistant, someone who could help with the chemical assays needed to measure blood sugar. MacLeod himself would then depart for his annual summer holiday in Scotland, leaving Banting and the student to their work. It was not a resounding vote of confidence, but it was enough. Banting returned to his life for the next few months, waiting for summer to arrive. In May of 1921, he packed his bags and moved to Toronto, a city buzzing with the energy of a new decade. He arrived at the University of Toronto's medical building, a grand, imposing structure on College Street. The lab space he was given was small, dusty, and poorly equipped. It was a far cry from the gleaming, modern laboratories we might imagine today. But to Banting, it was everything. Now, he needed his assistant. MacLeod had offered the summer project to 2 of his physiology students. They were both bright young men, and since only one was needed, they tossed a coin to decide who would get the job. The winner, as it seemed at the time, the loser who had to give up his summer vacation, was a 21-year-old student named Charles Best. Charles Best was in his final year of a physiology and biochemistry course. He was quiet, meticulous, and hard-working. Where Banting was a man of broad ideas and restless energy, Best was a man of detail and precision. He was the perfect counterpart. The two men met in the small, stuffy laboratory in mid-May. Banting, the determined surgeon with a hunch. Best, the careful young student who knew how to perform the delicate chemical tests to measure the amount of sugar in a sample of blood. They had 8 weeks. They had 10 dogs. And they had one simple, powerful idea scribbled in a notebook. The summer of 1921 in Toronto was hot and humid. While the city enjoyed the sunshine, Banting and Best began their work in the small, grimy lab. The first step was to prove Banting's hypothesis. They needed to ligate the pancreatic ducts of a healthy dog and wait for the organ to degenerate. This was delicate, difficult surgery. Banting's skills as a surgeon were put to the test. Day after day, they worked, their clothes sticking to them in the oppressive heat. The first surgeries were not successful. The dogs developed infections, or the ligatures didn't hold. Their small supply of animals began to dwindle. It was frustrating, grueling work, with no guarantee of success. But they did not stop. The city outside went on with its summer, but inside that small room, a quiet, intense race against time was underway. Chapter 3: Dogs and Discoveries. The work in the little lab on College Street was not glamorous. It was a world of pungent, antiseptic smells, the hum of basic equipment, and the constant, meticulous cleaning of cages. Banting and Best's first task was to create a diabetic dog. This was done by completely removing the pancreas from a healthy animal. Within hours of the surgery, the dog would begin to show all the classic signs of the disease: extreme thirst, frequent urination, and a rapid rise in its blood sugar level. 0. Best's job was to take tiny samples of blood from the dog and perform the painstaking chemical analysis to measure the sugar content. A healthy dog's blood sugar is around 0.1%. After the pancreas was removed, this level would climb to 0.3 or 0.4%, a fatal concentration. These dogs, now diabetic, were the test subjects. They were the patients waiting for a cure. At the same time, Banting was performing the other crucial surgery, ligating the pancreatic ducts of a different set of dogs. This was the core of his idea. They had to tie off the ducts, then wait for weeks as the digestive part of the organ atrophied. It was a period of anxious waiting. Every day, they cared for the animals, checking the surgical wounds, hoping the ligatures were holding, hoping the theory was correct. 0. Several of these dogs died from post-operative complications, each death a blow to their dwindling resources and their morale. By the end of July, after nearly 7 weeks of work, they were finally ready for the key experiment. One of the duck-ligated dogs was still alive and well. They put the dog under anesthetic, and Banting carefully opened the abdomen. He found the pancreas, just as he had hoped. It was shrunken and withered, a fraction of its normal size. The digestive cells had, in theory, died off, leaving only the precious islets of Langerhans. This was the moment of truth. Working quickly in the summer heat, they removed the shriveled organ. They immediately took it to the laboratory bench, where Best had prepared a chilled mortar and pestle with an ice-cold saline solution. They sliced the pancreas, ground it into a fine paste, and mixed it with the saline. Then they filtered this mixture through cheesecloth to remove the solid tissue. What was left was a murky, brownish liquid. This was it. Their extract. A substance they had begun to call islatin. Now they needed a patient. They went to the cage of one of their diabetic dogs. It was a collie-type dog, which they had operated on several days earlier. The dog was weak, listless, and clearly dying. Its blood sugar was dangerously high. With a syringe, Banting drew up 5 cubic centimeters of the brownish extract. He found a vein in the dog's leg and, with a steady hand, injected the fluid. Then they waited. The 2 men, tired, covered in sweat and grime from their work, watched the sick animal. An hour passed. Best drew a sample of blood. He took it to his corner of the lab to perform the sugar analysis. This was a slow, delicate process. Banting paced the small room, his nerves frayed. Finally, Best finished the test. He looked at the results. Then he looked at Banting. The blood sugar had dropped. It had fallen from 0.4 to 0.3%. It was a small drop, but it was a drop. It was working. A wave of elation and exhaustion washed over them. They gave the dog another injection. They waited another hour. Best ran another test. The blood sugar had dropped again, this time to 0.22%. The dog, which had been lying listlessly on the floor of its cage, began to stir. It lifted its head. It seemed stronger, more alert. For the first time in medical history, they had reversed the fatal progression of diabetes. In the quiet of that hot Toronto afternoon, in a dusty, forgotten corner of the university, a miracle was unfolding. The date was July the 30th, 1921. It was a landmark day. But their work was far from over. The dog's blood sugar did not stay down. As the effect of the extract wore off, the levels began to creep back up. They needed more extract, but they had used the entire degenerated pancreas. The process of ligating the ducts and waiting 7 weeks was too slow, too cumbersome to be a practical source. They needed a better way. They tried extracting from the pancreases of other species, like fetal calves, believing the digestive enzymes would not yet be active in an unborn animal. This showed some promise. They began to exhaust their funds, selling Banting's old car to buy more dogs to keep the research going. They worked around the clock, often sleeping on makeshift cots in the lab, grabbing meals when they could. Their most famous animal subject from this period was a yellow collie named Marjorie. Marjorie was made diabetic by the removal of her pancreas, but with daily injections of their crude extract, Banting and Best were able to keep her alive and remarkably healthy. She would greet them at the cage door, wagging her tail, a living, breathing testament to the power of what they had found. They kept Marjorie alive for 70 days, a feat that was simply unheard of at the time. In August, Professor MacLeod returned from his holiday in Scotland. He walked into his laboratory to find a scene of organized chaos. The place was a mess, but Banting and Best were buzzing with excitement. They showed him their notebooks, filled with pages of blood sugar readings. They showed him the charts, the clear, undeniable downward curves after each injection. They showed him Marjorie, the healthy, thriving dog that should, by all accounts, be dead. MacLeod, the cautious skeptic, was stunned. He listened intently. He examined the data. He asked sharp, probing questions. He was not yet fully convinced, but he could not deny the evidence before him. This was not another failure. This was a breakthrough. He immediately turned the full resources of his department over to the project. Banting and Best were moved to a larger, better-equipped lab. More assistants were assigned to help them. The shoestring operation was over. The race to refine and purify their discovery had begun. But a major problem remained. Their extract, while effective, was still very crude. The brownish, murky liquid contained many impurities. When injected, it often caused sterile abscesses, painful lumps under the skin. It could be used to keep a dog alive, but it was nowhere near pure enough to be safely used on a human being. Banting and Best were surgeons and physiologists. They had taken the discovery as far as their skills would allow. To take the next crucial step, to turn the crude islatin into a life-saving medicine, they needed a different kind of expert. They needed a biochemist. Chapter 4. The biochemist arrives. As the autumn of 1921 settled over Toronto, the atmosphere in the university's medical building was electric. Word was beginning to spread about the work being done in MacLeod's department. The team had a substance that worked, but they were hitting a wall. The challenge was purification. How could they strip away all the toxic contaminants from their pancreatic extract, leaving only the pure, active principle? Professor MacLeod knew just the person for the job. He invited a brilliant young biochemist named James Bertram Collip to join the team. Collip was a professor of biochemistry from the University of Alberta who was in Toronto on a sabbatical, working in MacLeod's department. He was known for his incredible skill and precision in the delicate art of separating biological substances. Where Banting was a man of vision and Best a man of careful measurement, Collip was a master of the chemical process. He was quiet, reserved, and intensely focused. At first, Collip was hesitant to join the project. He had his own research to pursue. But MacLeod was persuasive, and the challenge was irresistible to a biochemist of his caliber. In December of 1921, with the Canadian winter beginning to bite, Collip officially joined the team and set to work in his own laboratory, just down the hall from Banting and Best. His task was immense. He started with the crude extract that Banting and Best were producing from whole beef pancreases, which they were now getting from a local slaughterhouse. They had found that Banting's original, time-consuming method of ligating ducks wasn't necessary if the pancreas was harvested quickly and chilled immediately. Collip took this murky brown liquid and began to apply every chemical trick he knew. His method was a painstaking process of trial and error. He would take the ground-up pancreas and treat it with different concentrations of alcohol. He discovered that at a very specific concentration, around 90% alcohol, most of the proteins and other impurities would precipitate out meaning they would solidify and could be filtered away. But the active substance, the precious Insulin, remained dissolved in the alcohol. He would then carefully evaporate the alcohol, leaving a syrupy residue. But this was still not pure. He would wash it again and again, using different solutions, different temperatures, different centrifuges, each step designed to remove one more layer of contamination. It was like peeling a microscopic onion. After each new purification step, he would have to test the resulting liquid. He would inject it into a diabetic rabbit and then, like best, meticulously measure the animal's blood sugar. If the blood sugar dropped, he knew the active principle was still there. But he had to watch the rabbits carefully. If his extract was too pure, too potent, the rabbit's blood sugar could drop too low, causing convulsions and death. This, in itself, was a sign of progressive mark of the extract's power. The pressure was building. Banting and Best were growing impatient. They had made the initial discovery, and they were anxious to be the first to treat a human patient. 0. Oh, they continued to make their own, less pure extract, convinced it was good enough. Meanwhile, Collip worked methodically, almost secretively, in his own lab, refusing to be rushed. He knew that injecting an impure extract into a person could be disastrous. A toxic reaction could not only harm the patient but could also discredit the entire project. He had to be certain. As Christmas of 1921 approached, the team was working against a self-imposed deadline. They were scheduled to present their findings at a major medical conference at Yale University at the end of December. They needed a breakthrough. Collip worked tirelessly through the holiday season. The university halls were quiet and empty, the windows frosted over. In the stillness of his lab, surrounded by beakers and flasks, he finally found the last piece of the puzzle. After precipitating the impurities with high-concentration alcohol, he found that if he then lowered the alcohol concentration to a precise point, the active substance itself would finally precipitate out. He could then collect this solid precipitatio whitish powder and redissolve it in sterile water. The result was astonishing. Instead of the murky, brown, toxic sludge they had started with, Collip now held up a small vial to the light. Inside was a clear, colorless, watery liquid. It was pure. It was potent. And he believed it was safe. He had done it. He had refined the raw discovery into a medicine. He had perfected the process for creating a consistent, stable, and non-toxic extract. This was the true key, the final step that would allow the miracle to move from the animal lab to the human hospital ward. There was a palpable tension within the group. Banting, eager to proceed, felt that Collip was being too secretive about his methods. He and Best had tried to treat a patient with their own, less pure extract in early January, and the results had been disappointing. The injection caused a painful abscess and had only a minimal effect on the patient's blood sugar. It was a setback that proved Collip's caution was justified. Now, Collip was ready. He had enough of his purified extract for a human trial. He had unlocked the final door. The team stood at a historic threshold. In the wards of the Toronto General Hospital, a young boy lay dying. He was wasting away, drifting closer and closer to the inevitable coma. His name was Leonard Thompson, and he was about to become the first person in history to be brought back from the brink by the clear, pure liquid that James Collip held in his hands. The quiet work of the laboratory was about to meet the desperate reality of the hospital bed. Chapter 5. Leonard Thompson lives. In Ward H of the Toronto General Hospital, in the first week of January 1922, 14-year-old Leonard Thompson was fading. He had been admitted 2 months earlier, weighing just 65 pounds. He was suffering from a severe case of juvenile diabetes, and his family had brought him to the hospital as a last resort. He was being treated with the standard Allen starvation diet, but it was a losing battle. His hair was falling out. He was too weak to lift his head from the pillow. His parents sat by his bedside, watching the slow, heartbreaking decline, knowing that at any moment he could slip into the final coma. The physicians in charge of his care knew about the experiments happening just a short walk away at the university. They had been following the progress with a mixture of hope and professional skepticism. After much discussion, and with the consent of Leonard's terrified but desperate father, they agreed to allow the research team to administer their new extract. The first attempt took place on January the 11th, 1922. Banting and Best administered an extract they had prepared themselves. It was not Collip's purified version. They injected 15 cubic centimeters of their brownish fluid into the boy's buttocks. The result was disheartening. A painful, hard abscess formed at the injection site, and while his blood sugar showed a slight drop from a dangerously high 0.44% to 0.32%, it was not a significant clinical improvement. The team was disappointed. To outside observers, it looked like just another failure in a long line of failures. They stopped the treatment. For 12 agonizing days, Leonard Thompson's condition worsened. He was on the very edge of death. During this time, James Collip was working with feverish intensity in his lab, perfecting his purification process and building up a small but precious supply of his clear, potent extract. He was now confident that his version was not only effective but also safe. The team decided to make a second attempt. This time, they would use Collip's extract. On January the 23rd, the team returned to Leonard's bedside. The mood was heavy with a mixture of desperate hope and the memory of the recent failure. This time, the injection was different. Instead of a murky, irritating fluid, they drew up a small amount of Collip's crystal-clear solution. They administered the shot. There was no immediate, visible reaction. No abscess formed. The team began their now familiar vigil, taking blood samples every hour. The first results came back from the lab. Leonard's blood sugar had plummeted. It had fallen dramatically, from a life-threatening 0.52% down to a near-normal 0.12% within 24 hours. But more importantly, something else was happening. For the first time in weeks, the sugar and ketones that had been poisoning his system began to disappear from his urine. The clinical change was nothing short of miraculous. The boy, who had been listless and semi-conscious, began to stir. He became more alert. He looked at his parents with recognition and clarity in his eyes. 0S. The nurses and doctors watched in astonishment. Day by day, with continued injections of Collip's purified extract, Leonard Thompson began to come back to life. The change was visible to everyone who walked through Ward H. The boy's spirit and energy returned. He began to ask for food, and for the first time, he was allowed to eat a proper meal. The extract, which the team now officially named Insulin at MacLeod's suggestion, from the Latin word insula for island, was giving his body the ability to use the nourishment from the food. News of the astonishing recovery spread like wildfire through the hospital, and then through the city of Toronto. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. The years of theory, the long nights in the lab, the frustrating setbacks had all led to this. 0s. A dying boy was sitting up in bed, smiling and talking. Soon, other patients on the ward were being treated with the precious few drops of insulin that Collip could produce. One by one, the same miracle was repeated. 6 more diabetic children, all near death, all on starvation diets, began the treatment. The results were uniform and dramatic. As the insulin flowed into their bodies, the children began to awaken from their half-life. The ward, once a quiet, somber place of waiting, was transformed. The air, which had been heavy with resignation, was now filled with the sounds of returning life, of quiet laughter, of conversation, of hope. Doctors from all over North America began to hear whispers of the Toronto miracle. They started sending their most desperate cases to the Toronto General Hospital. One of the most famous was Elizabeth Hughes, the young girl we met earlier, the daughter of the American politician who had been wasting away on the Allen diet for years. By August of 1922, she was 15 years old and weighed only 45 pounds. Her mother brought her to Toronto, a frail, skeletal figure, so weak she could barely walk. She began receiving insulin injections under Banting's personal care. Her transformation was stunning. Within weeks, she was gaining weight. Color returned to her cheeks. Her letters home, which had once been filled with despair and the gnawing pain of hunger, were now brimming with life and excitement. She wrote about the food she was eating, the new clothes she needed because she was growing so quickly, the simple joy of feeling strong again. She would go on to live a full, healthy life, marrying, having children, and living well into her 70s, a life that would have been utterly impossible just months before. The success was undeniable, but it created an enormous new problem. The team could not make insulin fast enough. Collip's laboratory method was a delicate, small-batch process. He could produce enough to treat the patients in Toronto, but letters were now pouring in from all over the world. Parents of diabetic children wrote desperate, heartbreaking pleas. Doctors begged for even a single vial. The Toronto team had proven the miracle was possible. Now, they faced the staggering challenge of how to scale it. How could they turn a laboratory breakthrough into a medicine that could save millions? Chapter 6: Scaling the Miracle. The winter and spring of 1922 were a time of intense pressure for the Toronto team. They held the key to life for thousands of dying patients, but they could only produce it in tiny, precious quantities. The demand was overwhelming and heartbreaking. Every vial of insulin produced by Collip was priceless, and the decision of who would receive it was an agonizing burden. 0s. It became clear, very quickly, that a university laboratory was not equipped to become a pharmaceutical factory. Professor MacLeod, with his characteristic foresight, recognized that they needed an industrial partner. But he was also fiercely protective of the discovery. He was determined that this should not become a secret formula for a private company to exploit for profit. This was a gift to the world, and it had to be made available to everyone who needed it at the lowest possible cost. Their first and most important partner was right there in Toronto, the Connaught Antitoxin Laboratories. Connaught was a unique, non-commercial entity associated with the University of Toronto, dedicated to producing vaccines and antitoxins for public health. They had the expertise in large-scale biological production and a public service mission that aligned perfectly with MacLeod's vision. In early 1922, the university team forged a close partnership with Connaught Labs to scale up insulin production for all of Canada. The challenges were immense. Collip's delicate laboratory method had to be translated into a robust industrial process. What worked in glass beakers had to be made to work in huge metal vats. The early attempts were fraught with difficulty. Batches failed. The purity varied. At one point, Collip himself briefly lost the knack for his own process, a terrifying period where it seemed the secret might have slipped through their fingers. But through painstaking work, the teams at the university and Connaught standardized the method. The biggest bottleneck was the raw material, animal pancreases. To meet the growing demand, they needed a vast, steady supply. They organized a system with the city's slaughterhouses. Workers were trained to harvest the pancreases from cattle and pigs immediately after slaughter, pack them in ice, and rush them to the labs. Every organ was precious. The entire process became a race against time to prevent the delicate insulin molecule from degrading. Even with Connaught's help, the need was global. MacLeod knew they needed a major American pharmaceutical partner to meet the demand in the United States and beyond. He approached several companies, but one stood out. Eli Lilly and Company, based in Indianapolis, Indiana. The research director at Lilly was a man named George B. Clowes. Clowes had attended the medical conference at Yale in December and had been one of the few to grasp the profound significance of the Toronto team's initial, messy presentation. He had immediately offered his company's full cooperation. In the spring of 1922, a historic agreement was struck. The University of Toronto granted Eli Lilly an exclusive license to produce and sell insulin in the United States. But it came with strict conditions. Lilly would have the license for only 1 year. After that, it would become non-exclusive, allowing other companies to produce it as well. This was to prevent a monopoly. Furthermore, Lilly had to submit their production methods and the purity of their final product for approval by a special committee at the University of Toronto. The Toronto team would retain complete control over the quality and standard of insulin. The collaboration was a resounding success. The scientists at Lilly, led by the brilliant chemist George Walden, worked closely with Collip and Best. They refined the purification process even further, developing new techniques like isoelectric precipitation, which allowed for even larger scale production of a highly purified product. They solved the problem of standardizing the dose. How could a doctor in San Francisco be sure that his vial of insulin had the same strength as a vial used in Toronto? The Toronto Committee established the unit of insulin defined as the amount of extract required to lower the blood sugar of a rabbit by a specific amount. Every batch produced by Lilly or Connaught had to be tested and certified. By the autumn of 1922, the factory lines at Indianapolis were running. They were processing tons of pancreas glands, sourced from meatpacking plants all across the American Midwest. The logistics were staggering. It took the pancreases from as many as 6,000 cattle or 2,000 pigs to produce just 1 ounce of pure, crystalline insulin. The first vials of commercially produced insulin, sold under the trade name Eleventh, became available to physicians in the United States. The impact was immediate and profound. The small scattered miracles of Ward H in Toronto were now being replicated in hospitals and homes across the continent. Children were literally being raised from their deathbeds. The news was a global sensation. Medical journals published the astonishing case reports. Newspapers ran front-page headlines. Soon, the Toronto group was licensing the process to companies across the world. A partnership was formed with a Danish team, which would eventually lead to the creation of the company Novo Nordisk, still a major insulin producer today. The first vials of insulin were shipped across the Atlantic, arriving in London to save the lives of British patients. Within just 2 years of Leonard Thompson's first injection, the discovery made in a dusty Toronto lab had become a global enterprise, a coordinated international effort of science, industry, and logistics, all aimed at a single goal: saving lives. To ensure that no single person or entity would ever profit unduly from this life-saving discovery, Banting, Best, and Collip sold the patent for insulin to the University of Toronto for a token payment of $1 each. It was one of the most remarkable acts of medical philanthropy in history. They believed their discovery did not belong to them, but to the world. The quiet idea born in the middle of the night had blossomed into a global beacon of hope, a testament to the power of collaboration and the selfless pursuit of healing. Chapter 7: Insulin at War and Peace. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, insulin became a standard, life-altering therapy around the globe. A diagnosis of diabetes was no longer a death sentence, but the beginning of a manageable, chronic condition. The world was changing, however. The distant rumbles of conflict were growing louder in Europe and Asia. The approach of the Second World War would present a new and formidable challenge to the production and distribution of this essential medicine. When war broke out in 1939, insulin was a critical part of civilian life. But now, it also became a crucial element of military logistics. A soldier with diabetes was just as reliant on his daily injection as his comrades were on ammunition and rations. The Allied nations, principally Canada, the United States, and Great Britain, had to ensure that the supply chain for insulin remained unbroken, both for their citizens at home and for their soldiers in the field. The production at Eli Lilly in Indianapolis and at Connaught Labs in Toronto ramped up to unprecedented levels. These facilities became vital pieces of the war effort, as strategic as any munitions factory. The supply of animal pancreases, once a simple matter of logistics, was now complicated by wartime rationing and transportation disruptions. Yet the flow never stopped. The network of meatpackers, refrigerated trucks, and production chemists worked tirelessly to keep the vats full, and the purification lines running. For soldiers with diabetes, the military developed special kits. A soldier would carry a metal case containing a glass syringe, needles, and vials of insulin. They learned to administer their own injections in the barracks, in the back of a transport truck, or in a muddy trench. The insulin itself had to be protected from extreme temperatures, a significant challenge in the deserts of North Africa or the frozen landscapes of the European winter. Medical officers were trained in the management of diabetes under combat conditions, learning to adjust dosages for soldiers undergoing extreme physical exertion and stress. The presence of insulin in the medical corps' arsenal meant that thousands of experienced soldiers who happened to have diabetes could continue to serve their countries. The war also highlighted the fragility of global supply chains. In occupied Europe, access to insulin became a matter of life and death in a new and terrifying way. In countries like the Netherlands and Denmark, where production facilities had been established before the war, scientists and workers engaged in acts of quiet heroism. They stockpiled supplies, hid raw materials from occupying forces, and continued to produce insulin under the most difficult conditions, often distributing it through clandestine networks to keep their fellow citizens alive. The story of insulin during the war is a story of resistance fought not with guns, but with chemistry and compassion. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world was faced with a massive humanitarian crisis. The infrastructure of Europe was shattered. Millions were displaced, and the systems for delivering even the most basic medical care had broken down. The Allied nations, through organizations like the newly formed United Nations, undertook a massive effort to restore the supply of essential medicines to the devastated continent. Cargo planes that had once carried bombs now carried crates of penicillin and insulin. The post-war era saw a renewed focus on public health and international cooperation. The lessons learned during the war about large-scale production and distribution were applied in peacetime. Insulin production became more efficient, and the medicine became more widely available than ever before. For the first time, people in many parts of the world that had been untouched by the initial discovery now had access to this life-saving treatment. The generation of children who had been saved by the first vials of insulin in the 1920s were now adults. They were living full lives, getting married, building careers, and having children of their own, a reality that would have been unimaginable to their parents. They were the first generation to prove that a long and healthy life with diabetes was possible. The peace that followed the war was a time of great scientific optimism. The original insulin, while a miracle, was not perfect. It was a short-acting formula, requiring patients to take multiple injections throughout the day to keep their blood sugar stable. The search was on for a better, longer-lasting insulin. The quiet work in the laboratories, which had been overshadowed by the global conflict, now resumed with new vigor. The miracle of Toronto was complete, but the story of insulin was still evolving, driven by the peaceful pursuit of making a good medicine even better. Chapter 8: Nobel Prizes and Beyond. The world was quick to recognize the magnitude of what had happened in Toronto. The awards and accolades began to pour in. The most prestigious of all came in the autumn of 1923, less than 2 years after Leonard Thompson's recovery. The Nobel Committee in Stockholm announced that the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine would be awarded for the discovery of insulin. However, the announcement came with a shock that reverberated through the scientific community and created a tension that would linger for decades. The prize was awarded to two men, Frederick Banting and John MacLeod. Banting was furious. In his mind, MacLeod was merely the administrator who had provided the lab space and then gone on holiday. He believed the prize belonged to him and his young assistant, Charles Best, the two who had toiled through the hot summer of 1921. In a fit of righteous anger, Banting initially declared that he would refuse the prize altogether. He sent a telegram to the committee, a fiery protest against what he saw as a grave injustice. Friends and colleagues intervened, urging him to reconsider. They reminded him that refusing a Nobel Prize would be a slight to his country and to the discovery itself. He relented, but on his own terms. In a grand gesture of loyalty and recognition, Banting publicly announced that he would immediately give half of his prize money to his collaborator, Charles Best. He wanted the world to know who had been there with him in the lab from the very beginning. MacLeod, upon hearing of Banting's decision, felt compelled to make a similar gesture. He, in turn, announced that he would be sharing his half of the prize money with the fourth, often overlooked member of the team, the brilliant biochemist James Collip. It was Collip's purification process, after all, that had turned the crude extract into a usable medicine and made the human trials a success. And so, in the end, the honor was shared among the four men who each played a critical role. Banting, the visionary with the driving idea. Best, the meticulous assistant who made the crucial measurements. MacLeod, the experienced leader who provided the resources and guidance. And Collip, the master chemist who unlocked the final secret of purification. While the Nobel Committee's decision remained a source of debate for years, the sharing of the prize money became a symbol of the complex, collaborative nature of modern scientific discovery. The story of insulin, however, did not end with the Nobel Prize. The original insulin, now known as regular insulin, was a fast-acting but short-lived solution. It required patients to endure 3 or 4 injections every single day, a difficult and burdensome routine. The dream was to create a single injection that could control blood sugar for a full 24 hours. The next major breakthrough came in the 1930s from the same Danish group that had partnered with Toronto early on. A researcher named Hans Christian Hagedorn discovered that, by adding a protein called protamine, derived from the sperm of river trout, he could slow down the absorption of insulin into the bloodstream. This new formulation, called protamine zinc insulin, or PZI, was a significant advance. It lasted much longer, reducing the number of daily injections. Then, in the 1940s, the Danish lab developed an even better version. They created a crystalline form of protamine insulin that had a reliable, intermediate duration of action. They called it neutral protamine Hagedorn, or NPH insulin. For decades, NPH became the cornerstone of diabetes therapy around the world, the trusted workhorse insulin for millions. The science continued to advance, moving from the realm of the organ to the realm of the molecule. In the 1950s, the British scientist Frederick Sanger achieved another monumental breakthrough. He mapped the exact chemical structure of the insulin molecule. It was the first protein ever to be fully sequenced. This work, which also earned him a Nobel Prize, opened the door to an even more revolutionary idea. What if insulin could be made from scratch, without any animal pancreases at all? That dream became a reality with the dawn of the genetic engineering age in the 1970s. Scientists developed a remarkable new technology called recombinant DNA. They learned how to take the human gene for insulin and insert it into a common bacterium, like E. coli. By growing these modified bacteria in large fermentation tanks, they could turn them into tiny, living insulin factories. The bacteria would produce vast quantities of pure, human insulin identical in every way to the hormone produced by a healthy human pancreas. In 1982, exactly 60 years after Leonard Thompson's recovery, the first synthetic human insulin, produced by Eli Lilly using this new technology, was approved for medical use. It was a landmark moment. It freed the world's insulin supply from its reliance on animal organs and eliminated the rare allergic reactions some patients had to beef or pork insulin. From that point on, scientists could not only make human insulin, but they could also tweak its molecular structure, creating a whole new generation of designer insulins that act almost instantly, and others that provide a smooth, peakless background level for a full day or more. The quiet miracle of Toronto had entered the space age. Chapter 9: A World Transformed. Let us pause for a moment and reflect on the sheer scale of the transformation that flowed from that small Toronto laboratory. Before 1922, the average life expectancy for a child diagnosed with type 1 diabetes was less than 2 years. After insulin became widely available, that statistic was rewritten. Suddenly, these children could expect to live not just for a few more years, but for decades. They could grow up, go to college, build families, and grow old. An entire cohort of people who would have simply vanished from the world were now woven back into the fabric of society. The mortality rates for the disease plummeted. In the early 1920s, the number of deaths attributed to diabetes fell by 50% in cities across North America. The coma wards in the great hospitals emptied out. The sense of hopelessness that had surrounded the disease for 2 millennia was replaced by a new, powerful sense of control and possibility. The cultural impact was just as profound. The discovery of insulin became a powerful symbol of the promise of modern medical research. It was a clear, dramatic victory of science over disease. It inspired a new generation of scientists and fueled public support for medical research for the rest of the 20th century. The story of Banting, Best, Collip, and MacLeod became a modern legend, a tale of heroic discovery taught to school children. For individuals living with the condition, life was transformed from a state of passive waiting into one of active management. The person with diabetes became their own scientist, their own physician in a way. They learned to test their own blood sugar, to count carbohydrates, to adjust their insulin doses based on their meals, their exercise, and their daily rhythms. This new reality fostered a powerful sense of discipline and self-awareness. It created a strong, resilient community of patients and families who shared information, offered support, and advocated for their own needs. The technology of care evolved alongside the insulin itself. The large, reusable glass syringes and thick needles of the early days, which had to be sterilized by boiling before each use, slowly gave way to smaller, disposable plastic syringes with ultra-fine needles that made injections far more comfortable. Then came insulin pens, which combined the insulin cartridge and the needle into one convenient, discrete device. In the latter part of the century, the technology took another leap forward with the development of the insulin pump. This small, pager-sized device could be worn on a belt or carried in a pocket. It holds a reservoir of insulin and is connected to the body by a thin tube and a tiny cannula inserted just under the skin. The pump can be programmed to deliver a slow, steady trickle of insulin throughout the day and night, a basal rate mimicking the constant output of a healthy pancreas. At mealtimes, the user can simply press a button to deliver a larger dose, a bolus, to cover the carbohydrates in their food. More recently still, pumps have been integrated with another piece of technology, the continuous glucose monitor, or CGM. 0S. A CGM uses a tiny sensor wire, also inserted under the skin, to read the body's glucose levels every few minutes, 24 hours a day. It sends these readings wirelessly to a receiver or a smartphone, giving the person a real-time view of their blood sugar trends. The newest systems create a hybrid closed loop where the CGM talks to the insulin pump, allowing the pump to automatically adjust its basal insulin delivery based on the CGM readings. This is a major step toward the long-sought-after goal of an artificial pancreas, a system that could one day manage diabetes automatically, freeing the individual from the constant, minute-by-minute burden of care. Yet, for all this remarkable progress, the story of insulin in the 21st century is not without its shadows. The selfless act of the original discoverers, who sold their patent for $1, stands in stark contrast to the modern reality. The price of insulin, particularly in the United States, has soared to astonishing levels, creating a crisis of affordability. For many, the life-saving medicine that was intended as a gift to the world has become a crushing financial burden. People are forced to choose between paying for their insulin and paying for rent or food. Some have been forced to ration their insulin, taking less than they need, a dangerous gamble that can lead to devastating complications and even death, a tragic echo of the pre-insulin era. And so, the journey that began with a simple, hopeful idea in a quiet room in 1920 continues. The scientific miracle is secure. But the moral and economic challenge of ensuring that this miracle remains accessible to every single person who needs it, regardless of their ability to pay, is the unfinished chapter of this incredible story. The quiet work of ensuring that this gift truly belongs to the world goes on. And so, our story comes to a gentle close. We have traveled from the quiet, desperate wards of the past to the frontiers of modern medicine. We have sat in the stillness of a late-night office as a simple, powerful idea was born. We have felt the summer heat in a small Toronto lab, and we have witnessed the profound, breathtaking moment when a dying child opened his eyes and returned to life. The story of insulin is a story of many things. It is a story of scientific serendipity, of how a random article in a medical journal, read late at night by a tired country doctor, could change the course of human history. It is a story of perseverance, of the grueling, frustrating, and often thankless work in the lab that must happen long before any miracle can unfold. But most of all, it is a story of connection. It reminds us that the greatest breakthroughs are rarely the work of a lone genius, but of a team. A surgeon with a vision, a student with a steady hand, a leader with foresight, and a chemist with a gift for purification. Each one held a different piece of the puzzle. Only by bringing their talents together could they see the whole picture. As you settle now into your final moments before sleep, hold on to the quiet hope at the heart of this story. The world can be a complex and challenging place, but it is also a place where dedication, collaboration, and a selfless desire to heal can bring about extraordinary change. A single, clear idea, like a single drop of pure insulin, can spread outwards, bringing life and relief to millions. Let the gentle rhythm of this tale be a soft blanket for your mind. Let go of the day. Let go of your worries. There is nothing more for you to do now but to rest, to breathe, to drift into a deep and peaceful sleep, secure in the knowledge that even in the quietest of rooms, in the darkest of nights, the seeds of a miracle may be taking root. Good night. Sleep well.